Good morning to everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. We're going to be covering psychological safety in high-performing teams. The session is recorded, so if you need to drop off or you have to take a call and come back, you'll be able to catch up later, and we'll send out a link later in the week. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to First Nations people joining us today. A brief introduction from me. I'm Angela Franks, the partner for Fraser Jones in Australia. Fraser Jones is a global HR recruitment and search business operating across the whole spectrum of HR. In Australia, we have teams in Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne. I'm thrilled to be hosting this webinar. We have the most amazing lineup of panellists. So I'm actually in the room with everybody. This is the first time I've ever done one of the webinars where I haven't been on my own. So if you see me looking around the room, it's because I've actually got them talking in front of me, which is a pleasure. So we welcome Bernadette Thomas, CEO and founder of Rosby Consulting, Patrick Bruneau, who is head of people and culture at Diageo, and Sky Mackey, who is head of HR and transformation at Equifax. So as I mentioned, we're here in our office in Sydney for the first time, and if there's any technology hiccups, please forgive us. We'll be using the speaker from my computer, so if you can change your view to gallery, that will mean you'll be able to see us all at the same time. If you're on a mobile device, I can't help you. But Bernadette, Patrick and Sky will introduce themselves in a little bit more detail in a moment, but I'll just give you a little bit of background on, I guess, how we got to this topic and why we're here. So yeah, last year we started our Dare to Discuss series on menopause with Bernadette, and Bernadette's done so much work in this space. So, and Patrick also joined us for that breakfast event last year. So that's how we sort of started this little relationship. With Bernadette back in Sydney for the next couple of weeks, we were thinking about what's, a burning issue this year for HR. And this topic around psychological safety and high-performing teams, I think is just where we all find ourselves asking these questions in working life right now. So the world is changing, and as we enter hybrid working 2.0, which focuses more on the needs of a team, I feel like there's still sort of conflict and mismanagement around how teams need to work and that collaborative focus. So I think, we talked about if teams have all agreed what they're going to work, it shouldn't matter what other teams do, but that doesn't seem to ring true all the time. So that leads us to think about, what does a performing team look like? How do they act, interact, and what's that magic formula? So I'm now going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the discussion. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A. So the idea is to have the Q&A at the end, but if you ask questions as we go and I can throw something in, I will. But we'll go to Bernadette, Patrick, and then Sky. So Bernadette, over to you.
Thanks, Angela. So hi everyone and welcome. Thank you for giving up your time for the next hour. We hope that you will get something out of this. My name is Bernadette Thomas and I run a consultancy in HR. I've worked in Australia and around EMEA. I am based in the UK now, but I still hold Australia to my heart, very much so. So I run a consultancy which is focused on transforming culture essentially, and it starts with aligning people strategy with your business goals. And we do a lot of work with leadership development, coaching, and specialise in wellbeing and menopause. Today, though, I'm here to share insight into peak performance and looking at psychological safety, and I'll bring a little bit of my insight from EMEA to share with all of you. So thank you for joining.
Over to you.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. My name is Patrick Bruneau. I've been fortunate enough to have a varied career in both psychology and HR, and involves working across global and local positions across various industries. I did start as a specialist and I've moved into generalist positions over time, and I've enjoyed working with high-performing teams in multinational established brands, but also in startup situations through to sale. My latest adventure is with Diageo, and recently my focus areas have been culture, transformation, D&I, workplace strategy, and executive leadership and coaching.
Thank you. Sky.
Morning, everyone. I've got a slightly different story that I'm going to start with. My career actually started off working in a small cafe after school, doing some casual shifts. At the time, I had no idea that it would lead me to the rest of my career, but in one of those very strange, crazy pathways that you spin off into. So from cafes to restaurants and restaurants to hotels. And it was when I landed in hotel world that I ended up somehow, I don't know why, but I ended up somehow taking on the HR role, in addition to my day job, which was one of the assistant manager roles. But actually it was that HR role that then really got the bug inside me. And I decided that was the thing that I really wanted to do for the rest of my career. I've been privileged enough to travel the world with HR roles, and I've spent a lot of time over in the UK. So Bernadette and I have been talking quite a lot. Currently I'm working for Equifax. If you don't know who Equifax are, we're a global data insights business. And most recently, I've been embedded in the transformation area. We are doing massive global transformation, shifting to Google Cloud and shifting to an environment called Data Fabric, which is very technical, but a big thing. And so I've been embedded in transformation, looking at our organizational design, the roles of the future, the capabilities of the future, and how that is going to have to connect into our new business model. So quite exciting stuff. It's a real shift away from the heart of what I have been doing for a number of years, which is more related to the topic that we're talking about today around leadership and culture development.
Thank you. So question 1, how do you know you're in a performing team? So we've talked a lot about this, but Sky, let's start with your thoughts on this. I know when we talked, we sort of said, can you be in a high performing team and not know? Talk us through your experience.
Yeah, it's a fabulous question, and it really got me thinking about things. And when I started reflecting on this, what became really obvious was that actually it's quite easy to spot when you're in a badly performing team, or a team that's just not in that stride. And then I thought, well, why is it so easy to spot that? Well, it's probably because your energy's being drained. Maybe you're in not a positive state of stress. And so it's easier to connect with that, but not so easy to really spot when you're in the moment of being in a team that is in a space of high performance. And I connected back over my experience and years that I've had working in a lot of different teams and industries to a team from a long time ago that I happened to lead. And I was thinking about the experience I had there. And the moment that it occurred to me that I actually had a great high-performing team was when somebody wanted to take it away from me. And I was like, no, you're not taking my team away from me. I've just done all this hard work to build this team, and we're actually in this space of performing really well. And there were 3 things that I think created that experience and that feeling that we had that high-performance mentality. Firstly, we were all in a space of actually performing in our best. Like we were largely doing great work. We were challenged and stretched in a positive way, not in a negative way. I think we were valued in the business, and we were definitely engaged in what we did. We thoroughly enjoyed what we did as a collective group. You all have off days, but as a collective, we enjoyed it. The second thing, and I think this is one that is really quite important, and it's a harder one to build, we genuinely cared about each other. And that used to translate into, we did a lot of travel, and we used to call each other in the mornings when we're traveling on the road, and in the evenings at the end of the day. And it was to check in with each other. How was your day? What happened? What was good? What wasn't good? Can I help? All that kind of stuff. And it was checking in, not checking up on. And that, I think, is the big difference. I've worked in a lot of teams where you have had that checking up on. You've probably all experienced that as well. It's not so much fun. I think the third thing that really occurred to me about that particular team and why I felt like we were in high performance is because we all had the right mix of skills. We all had our clearly defined roles. We had good processes in place, which we'd worked hard to build, and we knew how to leverage that from each other, and we knew how to rely on each other in terms of strengths and what we were really good at doing. So it's those 3 things that I think really contributed to that sense that I still hold today, a long time later.
And it is funny because that check-in versus check-up, it's such a different feeling, and you can't even sort of like define it. I was on a drive back from Melbourne, and I was on my own in the car for 10 hours, and I think I spoke to the whole team the whole way home. But they all I don't know if they were deliberately tag teaming, but I definitely didn't. There was no problem with me falling asleep on that car journey. Right. So Bernadette, let's chat to you about, what you've seen in high performing teams. I think we talked a lot about the feedback culture, didn't we?
Yeah. So I think this is really true of high performing teams. And I think what Sky mentioned, we'll come into a lot more detail later as we talk, but certainly around creating a culture of feedback. So where people feel like They can give you feedback anecdotally, whether it's in person or over email, but it could be formal, informal. It's just having a culture where people feel like they're getting immediate feedback and it's timely. It's something that is really encouraging and it's seen as something that's a learning opportunity. So where we've seen it work really, really well is where leaders take on that role modeling of how they approach feedback as well. So not only how they give feedback, but how they take on feedback and really listen to the feedback that's been given from their team members. It's regular, it's ongoing. It's these check-ins. It's not a check-up on people. It's how are you actually doing with this? Do you need some help with anything? How are we getting on with X, our project that we're going on, that we're running through at the moment? And I think it's important to remember that every single team is different. So you might have a project that is a year-long project, and you might have a very immature team in terms of the team working together. And so you might need to be having more weekly check-ins that then might go into regular, ongoing, monthly or quarterly formal reviews of the work that you're doing. But you might be a very mature team, and then you might only have to have 6 weekly or quarterly reviews. And again, it depends on the work that you're doing. I do think also that what I've seen from some really great teams is they practice radical candor. So I'm sure many of you know the Kim Scott model, but it's very personal feedback and it's direct feedback. And this is where you can really learn from each other, but also your own behaviours and take on board what people are saying to you. I think that this really helps when we're thinking about an annual review cycle. That annual reviews, they happen once a year. It's in the title, obviously, but they don't always work because you're not able to pick up on what's working, what's not working, any opportunities, any risks that might be coming up. And certainly, as the economic and political situation is very uncertain, it creates more opportunity to have these, or it becomes more important to have ongoing conversations that aren't just about, well, let's set an annual goal. Actually, they might need to be far more iterative than that. And I also think about some of the stuff that Google did through Project Aristotle. So this is where they were doing some research into what makes a team effective at Google. I mean, it's quite an old project that they were researching, but the one that underpins everything is psychological safety. And then it's all about clear goals. And I think, like Sky, you mentioned that in terms of having something that everyone knows what they're working on. You've got dependable colleagues and your work is meaningful. So it's no good having someone who's the best at a certain skill and then trying to get them to do something else if they're a specialist in that field. It's got to be something that is meaningful to you as an individual and belief that your work has an impact as well. So I think for me, they're the things that we're seeing a lot more with high performing teams.
Thank you. And I think I went to a conference a couple of weeks ago and the comment was annual anything is too late.
So
does anything?
Yeah.
Maybe even birthdays. So actually before I go to Patrick, there's been a couple of questions in the chat. So maybe Sky and Bernadette, if you can take a quick look at those. While we talk to Patrick about what sort of traits you've tended to see in high performing teams, and then maybe before we move on, we can just have a quick commentary on those questions and then move on. Sorry, also Bernadette, they were asking, I think, about the radical candor, or there's a question there about what the feedback was called. So maybe if you let me know, I can put that in an email later.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Over to you, Patrick.
Traits in high-performing teams, I guess to Sky and Bernadette's point, it starts with that shared vision or direction, that collective sense of purpose. And what I've seen in the teams I've worked with and collaborated with is it's underpinned by a great sense of values, right? And they're constantly reinforced and practiced within the team through not only behaviour, but through their language and interaction. And that brings meaning to work. And also, what are the principles of success? That's really well defined in high-performing teams. And that really brings that collective, belonging as well. We all know that trust and respect is fundamental to teams. It provides a great platform for high challenge and high support. And there are many models that espouse this, like the Lencioni model, for example. And that platform really gives a chance for people to explore ideas in a safe way, but also drives innovation. And studies show that the higher levels of trust and respect and psychological safety that you practice, the greater levels of exploration of ideas and innovation. That then leads to, what we talk about all the time in high-performing teams is inclusion, that sense of belonging. You can definitely understand when you are part of the team and when you're not part of that team. And, we all have, many different sayings where you could have a team of, superstars or a superstar team. And I think it all comes down to that inclusion and belonging. In a high-performing team, what we've found time and time again is everyone can lead. And I think your ability to, exchange power throughout the team and have people lead and feel confident in leading can also lead to some great performance. Open and clear communication, obviously fundamental, especially in the feedback loop you mentioned, Bernadette. Frequency is important. How you express that, but also that genuine care you talked about as well is really important. High-performing teams also just look at ways of working that serve to empower people toward achieving that shared vision. So they really breed an environment where it's peer-driven, but it's really developing that independence in terms of your performance, not creating dependencies. And I think that's where there can be some frustration amongst the teams if you're highly dependent. The last one, which is one that I find the most impactful, certainly in my experience, is appreciation and gratitude. Not for the work, but who the individuals are and respect for what they do. And this is often missed because we seek recognition, external rewards, things like this. But in my experience, especially globally, discretionary effort was often fueled in teams by just giving them that sense of belonging and appreciation for their personality, who they are, and gratitude for what they bring to the group, not for their work. So, moving forward, I'll be thinking about how you actually practice these things and practice these behaviours within the team. These are not one-off kind of scenarios.
And I think it's really interesting because actually one of the questions here is how do you ensure that a check-in is a check-in, not a check-up? And again, it's how it feels for the person receiving it. And that's a complicated area. And every individual in your team may be different. Or have a different feeling on that. It's weird. It's not weird, but it's hard to describe, isn't it?
Yeah, I think perhaps it's also about intention. So if you're calling someone with the intention that you're actually checking up on them, even if you're trying to disguise that, people aren't silly. They're going to figure that out. And I think the other thing is, there was an organisation I worked with a few years ago which had a practice of checking up on people. And it really was that obvious. People talked about it, they knew it was happening, but it still went on. And it'd be in the morning, and it was with senior managers, people who covered a big region. Their operational manager would call them every morning, where are you? And that question, where are you, was to find out exactly their location. Are you in the store yet? Have you made it to the store yet? If you haven't, how come you haven't made it? It was a really loaded question. So I think part of that is about your intention, and then the other part is about being consistent. So if you do a one-off and you just do it as a check-in, as a one-off, that's not going to have any impact. If it creates into a bit of a habitual way of operating, and people then know that they can trust that that's what you're doing, you're checking in to make sure that everything's okay and that can you lend support, that's going to build up a different impact, and that will start to create that element of trust and psychological safety.
And Sky, one of the questions from Sean was around, he talks about the research that shows the causation. He says, how does this, can you see that question there? It's in the chat.
Oh, right.
Yeah, sorry. Research shows the causation is more likely to be high-performing team create good interpersonal relationships. How does this concept fit with your experience?
Good interpersonal relationships. Well, I think that's exactly what we had in that team example that we were talking about. We had a pretty effective interpersonal relationship sense that flowed throughout all the teams. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't without moments where we had difficulties or challenges, or that there might have been a falling out, but it was the way that I responded to that and stopped any of the downward spiral stuff pretty quickly. And I think that's important, because then you're saying, no, this is what's acceptable in this team, and this is what I want to have role modeled in the team, and this is how we respond to it. But equally, most of those team members, they used to seek out feedback from me. And, you know, talking back to Bernadette's point, I mean, that was actually quite incredible. I'd never come across that before, but people, they wanted to find the feedback. They wanted their annual reviews. I know that's shock horror, but they did. They used to make sure they put that time in my diary. They didn't wait for me to do it. It was quite refreshing. I've never actually seen that sort of behaviour, but it was because they really genuinely cared, and they cared about the feedback that I would give them in order to make them, you know, even better, even more effective, to stretch and challenge them that little bit more.
Good. Well, actually, on that point, why don't we move on to, because we're going to talk about the difference between high performance and peak performance. I haven't spoken to anybody in great detail about either topics from a psychological or technical perspective, but the whole concept of peak performance came about at a conference I was at a couple of weeks ago. So, and it was some of the things that the concepts that they were sharing were actually really interesting. So this is why I was thinking it's hot on my list of things to chat about. So there is the view that high performance isn't the right thing to be focusing on, and that it should be more about peak performance. And I've just got some fancy graphs that I won't share. But Bernadette, what have you seen in a team environment that allows sort of a team to perform consistently, but maybe in more of that peak performance sort of model?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that if we can imagine is like an elastic band. And when you are stretching an elastic band, and that point where it's like it's not overly stretched, but the team can consistently work at that rate, you've got to think about all the things that are going on around it. So if you're stretching the elastic band, you don't want it to stretch so far that it won't go back. So what do you need to do? You need to put some things around the elastic band and around the team that are going to support it. So really about well-being, I think they're the ultimately, when you think about a sports team, for example, when that sports team is the best sports team there. And Sky, you mentioned about belonging and having a sense of connection. I mean, this goes into Gallup's engagement. When you have a best friend at work, you are most likely to be engaged in the job that you're doing. And it says so much about that connection element and creating a sense of team. When the team is working well, you're working at that high level, but you also know that you're supported by your colleagues. You know that if you're going to go on holidays, someone's going to pick up the work that you're doing. It's not just going to fall flat. You know that someone's checking in on you, but on a personal level, not checking up on the work that you're doing. And one of the things we also notice about teams that are working at that peak performance is the rest of the business really relies on them. So what's the protection you have around the team to make sure that that team can consistently perform at that level of peak performance? And so making sure that you've got, again, I could go back to a sports analogy. A sports team is going to have a nutritionist. They're going to have a sleep expert. They're going to have fitness experts around them to make sure that they're all performing at that top level, but together as a team. So making sure that trust is there, and that connection element, and making sure that there's downtime, because what you need to avoid is burnout, stress, and then absence as well. So things like those daily check-ins for team members. I've seen some businesses where they use weather metaphors. So what's the weather like for you today? And so if you said, well, today actually it's really sunny, you know you're going to be high energy. So recognizing when can we all be in a flow or synchronized at high energy. And maybe it's that one person is up because that's really important for the project at the time, or the delivery of whatever you're working on at the time. And that energy is high. So that's great if you're sunny, but what if you're cloudy? Then, okay, what might else be going on? And take the time to make sure that that person who might be feeling cloudy, is it a regular occurrence or is it just a one-off? And then you can work out the synergy in your team. And I think that's something that can really help some teams, is just understanding where everyone's at on their own well-being journey, as well as within the team, and making sure that you do have that downtime to recover, because recovery is just as important as working at that peak level. And that's when you see peak performance. And they're not always going to be a peak performing team, because you do have the downtime as well.
And I think to the sporting analogy, it's like every team has a physio.
Yeah.
Like it's not even questioned.
Yeah.
So no, I could do with a physio from here. Sky. So what are the layers of a high performing team versus a peak performing team that people kind of need to be aware of?
every Saturday morning, I take my daughter to Little Athletics, which is a bit of a sporting institution, back on that sporting theme. It's a bit of a sporting institution in Australia. And each week, she and her fellow competitors, they are encouraged to perform and compete against themselves. So to try and get to personal best, to beat their personal bests in all of the round of different activities that they participate in. And I think this is a really great way of thinking about the concept of peak performance. So how can I do something just that little bit better than maybe I've done it previously? How can I get myself into that mindset where I know I'm going to perform at my very best for the period of time that I need to be doing that? So I think peak performance, to Bernadette's point that she was just talking about, it happens in bursts. You know, you're not going to be able to maintain that peak forever in a day, because you'll just burn yourself out completely. You need your downtime, you need your rest time, you need your recuperation time. So on contrast, I think high performance is more about clear roles and processes, and some of the things that I was describing before with the team that I talked about: a common purpose and goals, relationships that are really good, the interpersonal relationships that are good, robust communication, and I think accepted leadership role. I think that's a really important part of the high performance makeup. And I think together, all of those things are what help contribute to creating that high performance environment. I watched a movie a few weeks ago called True Spirit, which is a real story. And if anyone's seen it, you'll know why I'm smiling. It's an absolutely heartwarming story, but also heart-stopping story at times. It tracks Jessica Watson's solo sail around the world in her lovely boat called the Pink Lady. And this is at the tender age of 16. There was a lot of controversy at the time about whether she should do it or not. But when you watch the movie and you see how that all came together, and her determination and bravery to do that, it really made a lot of sense. So while she was the solo sailor, she wasn't alone. She needed to have a high-performing team around her to help her deliver that success at the end of making her journey all the way around the globe. And that's because they had agreed roles, they had processes that they had agreed and set up, and they practiced and rehearsed them over and over again. At the end of the day, though, she was the leader. She made the ultimate decisions when she was on that boat, because it was her life that was, at stake there. So she had to make those final decisions, given all of the information and advice she'd received. So I think, generally speaking, high performance got her around the world. But if you're thinking about it in terms of peak performance, that's what got her through the really tough moments, those massive big storms. And there was a particularly really bad experience right towards the end. I'm not going to spoil it for anyone if you haven't seen it. But that was going to ensure that she had to be in that peak performance. And that peak performance moment, I think, is when it all comes together. It's working seamlessly and you feel like it's in flow. You're not really thinking about it. It's the same as when you get in the car and you finally realize that you got from A to B and you didn't think about it. It's because you're actually right in that zone and you're at that element of being able to perform at your very best.
Mm-hmm. Sky, you just at the start of that, you mentioned about accepted leadership. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think, that's a big concept in itself. I think accepted leadership, what I mean in that space is having someone in that leadership role that people actually recognise as a leader, and they respect that that's a leadership role, and they respect that sometimes that person has to make decisions that will be the final decision. They may not always agree with that, but when that decision's being made, and this comes back to the Lencioni thing, when that decision's made, you line up behind it and you absolutely support it and you go. And that is a big contributing factor, I think, towards a high performance team environment.
Patrick, what have you seen from a high performance versus peak performance?
Well, on the peak performance side of it, what really resonates with me is obviously, lifting yourself with those high arousal states to perform is one thing, but you've got to be realistic about how long you can do that for. So the practice elements that you mentioned are really important. Having a team around you that can understand and lift you up when you're not in peak performance, but also just practicing self-regulation. I think a lot of those times when you're around people who practice, who show consistency in that space within those teams, you tend to take on those habits as well. And I think that's an important thing. High-performing teams tend to continue to learn from each other, and they continue to lift the performance of those around them. And that's been great. I think one of the best experiences for myself was when I'm going into teams or working with others where I don't have the knowledge, I don't have the experience, but they will bridge the gaps and help me to learn and accelerate. And it's been quite a rewarding experience throughout my career.
Should we move on now to sort of the more technical elements of psychological safety? I think, Patrick, you're going to help us explain the new legislation.
Sure.
and what that means for psychological safety in the workplace.
Yes, look, I'll give you a brief overview on this, but look, I think it's really, really positive. First and foremost, the legislation takes a very positive view and a very deliberate view around addressing psychosocial or mental health hazards in the workplace. And that's how it's conceptualized in the Work Health and Safety Act. And so in doing that, there's a focus on organizations to manage and address psychosocial hazards or risks that are, the results of things in the design and management of work, the work environment itself, workplace interactions or behaviours, or basically in circumstances or situations where they may cause psychological harm. And whilst the legislation and the workplace is struggling at the moment to understand how that's conceptualized, I think as HR practitioners or leaders in the organisation, I think consider your workplace, your values, how work is designed to be able to do that. But some of the examples as per Safe Work talk about things like job demands, low job control, support structures. There's some slight changes in terms of bullying and harassment, remote work, violence and aggression, and inadequate reward and recognition. And whilst some of these may be, your classical kind of, examples, there are many nuances to all of this that we need to consider. So when I was thinking about this, I'm like, okay, what's the challenge in the workplace for everyone online? What's the challenge ahead of us? And the challenge is, how do you identify psychosocial risks? So really, how does your organization conceptualize this and identify this? The next element is how do you, assess the impact? And there's always that kind of, struggle between the impact to others and the impact for the individual. And that's often been something that's underrepresented in legislation, particularly in work and harassment, for example. So the victim, what's the impact on the individual versus the intent and impact in legislation as well and the workplace. What are the control risks? What are the strategies to minimize or eliminate the risk? And for some of you, that may be something that you can achieve. For others, this will be a journey for you in the workplace. And that's really important. The legislation and Safe Work will always look favorably on those who are actively seeking to minimize those psychosocial harms. The last is the feedback element. And in high-performing teams, they tend to do this quite often. They practice this in the workplace, same with psychological safety. When you practice those behaviours, the feedback loop is definitely there. So again, how do you review your control measures, get feedback, and how effective they are? I guess, what does it mean for psychological safety, or what's the role that it plays when it comes to this legislation? I think that first and foremost, you need to consider how you're embedding and practicing psychological safety in your workplace. And when you do that, then you're actively looking to reduce stress or the incidence of stress in the workplace. How you define that within your organization is very important. I think there are roles inherently that are stress-induced. And we know that high-performing teams are often, have character traits that are high achieving and that tend to put stress on themselves. So how do we manage those arousal states, or how do we stop individuals from going into distress and moments of distress? The other one is, how do we create a safe environment for individuals to raise and report issues? And I think that's really the most important. Teams that practice psychological safety are more likely to raise issues in real time. Talked about owning leadership. That could be in a state of an emergency where you do take a leadership role and you report the incident, or you report, how this incident can be managed with others. Lastly, the Safe Work, framework. If you're wanting to really embed that in your organization, psychological safety is at the heart of that. Okay, you are not going to be able to manage stress in the workplace, navigate this without having some really open discussions of where you are today and where you'd like to be tomorrow. And I think that's the most important thing. We go back to what are the traits of high-performing teams? There's a shared vision in our workplace. Everybody goes home safe. What does that mean? And how do we bring that into practice? How do we talk about that regularly? How do we reinforce those principles and values?
There's a question about when the regulations start, and I've actually got Cilla Robinson in a couple of weeks doing a legal update. Maybe it's a better question for her, but do we know the date?
October last year was a soft start.
Okay, so yeah, there we go. Okay,
so
soft start. What does it mean?
Well, I don't think it's been explicitly communicated in a way where organisations have been given the call to action.
Okay.
However, I think we have some cases that are going to go through and create some precedents and how we manage some of these. I think the difficulty with this is sometimes you can feel but not see some of these psychosocial nuances, and I think that's going to be the challenge as legislation evolves and as the workplace deals with these on a case-by-case basis.
I think next we were going to talk about what sort of promotes psychological safety in the workplace, but I think it might actually be more helpful to talk about what erodes it, because I think we've talked a lot about what helps it, but maybe don't want to be negative, but I think that's probably, we haven't covered that. What do you?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think to Scar's point, when you're in a high-performing team, and we all can reach back to an experience or a scenario where you're not in a great team, and you could be going through a storming or forming scenario or change or what have you. And I think the thing to consider here is, what are the behaviours that erode psychological safety? Anxious avoidant behaviour is a huge one. Blaming others in the workplace can really, erode trust, erode the fabric, and go against the values of the organisation or the values of the team. So I think it's really, really important to consider that. How you take on other people's ideas, I think, is really important, and that comes with some really basic behaviours we take for granted sometimes. Your active listening skills. I'm often told I need to be more present, and it's something that I'm practicing every day. But it is something that's really, really important. And slowly, it may not do it in the first instance, but over time, it does erode trust. It does erode that sense of belonging with individuals. We talk about this all the time, and it's lack of care. And sometimes individuals don't explicitly, come to work to show lack of care. You have competing priorities or what have you. But when an individual reaches out to you, I think, think about why they're reaching out to you. Think about how you give empathy rather than sympathy. Sympathy can be rather dismissive to other individuals, and that can often erode trust and support as well in the workplace. And the last one is that self-awareness. We all have very busy lives, children, partners, sporting commitments, dogs,
cats,
you name it. And I think when all those things are competing, high-performing teams understand that you need to leverage or step into those spaces more so than not, and work may not be the priority, but having that awareness and flagging, that's really important. You'd hate to show that someone is not a priority or not having that awareness in the workplace is really important.
And I think one of the questions from Luke is about the psychological safety with high-performing teams, which we'll come on to in a bit, but it talks about it being an uncomfortable topic and sort of what strategies would you recommend for developing the psychological safety? So I think we're probably going to cover that as we go rather than being one specific question. But Sky, what behaviours do we need from leaders, but like real behaviours rather than, because we've sort of alluded to pretend behaviours sometimes, if the check-in versus the check-up. So I guess, my question is, how do senior leaders embrace real psychological safety? Or just leaders, they don't need to be senior. Any leader.
I think the short answer is not overnight. This is a long build, and the three words that are on my screen, care, trust and belonging, are the three words that we have been focusing on at Equifax for the last 3 years in building a culture of care, trust and belonging, bringing compassion to our leadership community. And that is not one-dimensional, that is multi-dimensional, and it's been an ongoing, unfolding piece of work, and it continues. We're not going to let it go. It's big because those things, to create that as a community of how we respond to things in a business, is really tough. I think that something that occurred to me when I was considering this whole nature of psychological safety inside teams was a recent conversation I had with a parent at school who is Australian Korean. And I just finished watching a lovely TV show. It sounds like all I do is watch TV shows, but I don't. I promise you I don't. But I finished watching a lovely TV show, and I've noticed in the Korean language that there was an expression that they used all the time. It was called simnida. Excuse anyone who happens to be Korean for any appalling accent, but I was asking about that term and what it meant, and he explained that it's a way in their language of showing respect to elders, to someone professional, or in formal situations, which is why we were hearing it, because it was a legal show. He then went on to describe that historically in Korea, they'd had a really poor incidence of air traffic disasters. And that was because instead of first officers being used as a second source of knowledge and experience, what had happened was that Korean first officers would stay silent if they heard, if they saw that something was about to happen or a disaster that was, pending. They wouldn't say anything to the captain. They wouldn't question the captain because the captain was more senior and therefore in charge. And that resulted in a really high rate of disasters. They actually had to address that systemically because culturally this is what they do, and it's not just a language thing. It's about a behaviour and how you actually interact with your elders. He also said that in conversation in Korea, when you first start introducing yourself, you actually ask someone's age so you can get the language right around it. So this is like really ingrained behaviour, but actually what it demonstrates at the absolute root cause, there's no trust and there's absolutely no psychological safety. If I challenge you, I will be shot. I will be, something bad will happen to me. It won't be an acceptable thing. So I think the simplest way for any leader in a business, no matter how junior or senior you are, is to start role modeling it. And there are a few things I think that you can do really simply. Everybody can tell when a senior leader is just talking the talk and not walking the walk. You're being watched. You're being watched all the time, even when you don't know you're being watched. And Timothy Clark's 4 levels of psychological safety are a good way of trying to think about this in practical terms. So I think three really basic things, and Patrick started alluding to some of them actually. During team meetings, encourage everyone to contribute and share their ideas. Everyone has teams where, some team members might take up more airtime than others. Some team members are more happy to, they talk to think rather than think to talk. And there'll be some team members who are very happy to sit in the shadows. Find ways to change that balance so that you get more of a balance. Find ways to bring that out in people in a safe and comfortable way. We have someone in our team at the moment, in the broader HR team, who it's taken several years for her to get up the courage to feel happy enough to actually voice an update, a really simple update in an open team call. But she now does it, and she did one this morning before I came to join this call. And I could see the growth within her, and I'm sure she feels that herself. So that's the first thing, very simple to do. The second thing I think is think about how much time you spend listening, and Patrick alluded to this as well. How much time do you spend listening versus talking in any environment? If you're interacting with your team, whether it's a formal team meeting or whether it's just a conversation, are you using more of this than you are of this, which is what I say to my daughter, or are you using more of this than you are of these? You've got 2 of these and 1 of these. That's hard, right? It's really hard to do because the desire, particularly when you're in leadership roles, is to get into that solution solving. Well, you don't need to have all the solutions, and sometimes your team will have a better solution than you do. So give them some time to think about it. The more you listen, the more they'll talk. And then the third thing is, and again, Patrick alluded to this, is how you respond to mistakes. Amy Edmondson, in her research, did a lot of work with some big hospitals in the US. And she interrogated all kinds of things around the culture of those hospitals and also around mistakes. And when she first started to correlate those results, what she found was actually the hospitals that had worse psychological safety had a lower incident rate of mistakes, and those that had higher psychological safety had a higher incident rate of mistake reporting. And then she figured it out, and she figured out that actually because those hospitals that had psychological safety had the higher mistake rate, it's because they were actually telling people that they'd made mistakes. They didn't feel that fear of voicing a mistake when it had been made. And that sort of takes me back to an incident that I had with a team member quite a few years ago now, where I arrived into the office one morning and he immediately pounced on me and said, I've got to tell you something. I've got really bad news. I thought, oh God, what's happened? So he starts describing this situation that's gone on, and basically he'd sent an email, but he'd sent it to the wrong person. And it was quite an email, right? It had a lot of, confidential information internally, but confidential information in it. And you could see the look on his face. He was in absolute fear. So I then said, okay, so what have you done about it? And what are you going to do about it? And what's the next steps? And he'd already solved the whole thing. He'd done everything that he needed to do. And he was absolutely beating himself up. And I said, okay, well, you won't do it again, will you? Because because of how you feel. And he was totally flabbergasted that I'd responded that way, because he was expecting the parent-child kind of response of, you've done bad. So I think how you respond to mistakes is incredibly important in building that psychological safety. The finger pointing and the blame game is always a good indicator that you've got very low psychological safety and trust.
Sophie actually put a post up in the chat about Amy's the short questionnaire. You guys are on the same. You should meet for a coffee.
I've actually written down.
Yeah. There's a lot of the same. It's funny actually, because we had somebody working for us, and I was at a funeral, and I saw a couple of messages like, "Please call me urgently," and so I went out, and I thought she'd been robbed or like something physical. Like, she was very upset. And she'd sent the wrong interview confirmation to the wrong candidate, and they turned up at the wrong interview, which, to an experienced recruiter it's not funny, but she was absolutely distraught. And I was like, oh, thank God. I thought like something had really bad happened. Like, this is not really bad. It's bad, but not really bad. But I don't think she expected me to react like that either. So, but I think that's experience. Like, a younger leader, like not age, but like in their journey, would probably get annoyed at that, perhaps. I think, it's about timing as well, isn't it? But Bernadette, for you, I've got a double whammy. Okay. So I'm really keen to hear about sort of what we're talking about, how that plays out in the UK and Europe at the moment. I don't know how similar or dissimilar it is in terms of like culture-wise and where you guys are at. But also, one of the questions is around performance management. So having the psychological safety in a performance management situation, is that a bit of a slippery slope? So if you want to answer two or just one, you decide.
I'll go with the performance management one really quickly first. And I do think that there's so much around feedback. Like, if you're thinking about, if you've got to a point where somebody is on a performance management review plan or PIP or whatever you want to call them in your organization, then potentially you've not been giving enough feedback as you're going along. So it depends on what you want to get out of the performance management. Is it that this person just isn't at a point where they're able to improve at all? And then it's thinking about, well, what's the learning for the individual? Or actually, have they just not been getting the feedback? Has it actually not been really clear set expectations about what this person is supposed to be doing? And I think Sky and Patrick, you both mentioned the fact that when you're giving those really clear guidelines to people, then they should understand what good looks like. So there's a lot of work that Brene Brown does in this field, which is all around what good looks like. And I think this is where it's not about a telling conversation. So in terms of leadership behaviours, what we're seeing is more around it's collaborative approach. It's not telling, it's more coaching. So let's paint what this looks like. How does that feel for you, etc. Those sorts of questions to really get the most out of the individual. So they can work really hand in hand. And if it's just that, okay, we're not at that place, and actually psychological safety doesn't exist at a different layer within the organization, so it might exist in your team but not organizationally, then potentially that's coming down. And actually, one of the things I was going to talk about, so this is my second part of the answer, is around just recently, one of the businesses that I've been talking to, they last year had decided that because of all of the economic and political uncertainty, and it certainly has been hitting the UK a lot harder because of thanks to Brexit and other issues going on over there, but they decided that there were not going to be any salaries or bonuses. And although they'd had all of their ratings in for their year-end performance, they decided that 50% of the entire business needed to be underrated. So that no one got a salary or bonus, a salary increase or bonus. And that then led to what was a very psychologically safe environment really coming undone. A lot of people felt like that was something that they then were not.
I'm so sorry.
Right.
I turned that off. It's off. It doesn't want to go away.
Stop really there.
Hang on, I've really got to turn that off.
So I think that it's something that we need to take on board, which is it isn't just, oh, tick box, we're done, we are psychologically safe. Actually, it's something that you need to consistently work at, especially when you're going through economic downturns. I mean, you just look at Twitter, for example, and coming in with a new leader and what that caused in terms of fear and uncertainty for everybody at Twitter. It's happening everywhere, maybe not to the same degree, but cost cutting. If you're not designing your organization to be sustainable in the future and you're just doing little bits here and there, that causes a lot of uncertainty and mistrust with lots of people. So it's about putting in place things that are going to sustain psychological safety. And one of the things that you can continue to do is holding honest Q&A sessions and being as transparent as possible and consistently communicating. And that will continue to build on the trust that you already have, even if people do start to feel fearful of their jobs. And there might be other things going on, especially around financial implications for individuals if they're not getting salary increases. Costs are just astronomical. I know they are here, definitely, and it will only get worse, I suspect, because we're probably a bit further ahead. But it just, if once that's broken, we're seeing a lot less people wanting to experiment. There's less creativity, less innovation. And it's just creating heightened stress levels, which is driven by fear, which really does break down psychological safety.
On the, what really resonates with me, Bernadette, on that is just the cultural elements you talk about, right? And the performance discussion. I think the question in the slippery slope that I've got up here, I think it's a slippery slope when you've not had those discussions, when you've not practiced that beforehand. Yeah. That's when, you know, you're working against the norms or the values of the organization. I think the other side, we have a saying at the moment in our team, well, not at the moment, but ongoing, which is, you know, high care, high support. Right. So that means, you know, the feedback loop has to be constant and it has to be reinforced. It is collaborative. And what I really liked about what you said was the coaching element. I think that's what a lot of people really want moving forward. If there's one thing that I've seen in organizations around what do employees want from their leaders, it's coaching, it's time with their leaders to talk about not only themselves, but to listen, to listen and to hear them and to appreciate and show gratitude for who they are as individuals, and not only what they do.
We try to do 2 webinars with Scylla at UT's Edge, she's employment lawyer there, and we do HR horrors around Halloween. I might throw that question in because it'll be later in the year and we'll see if there's been any HR horrors on that exact topic. So anonymous attendee, tune in at Halloween to see where we land on that one. I think we're going to move. We've got 4 minutes to run. So let's do our last poll. That should pop up on the screen in a minute.
There's an interesting question in the chat, which
I've missed it, have I? Sorry. I've missed 5 messages. Yep. Okay.
So the one that is from Sarah, which is how can you change the culture of a team, is actually a high number across the business that are constantly late, absent, or leaving early. The employees are happy to not be paid, blah, 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 blah. I think I would have a multi-pronged approach for that. I'd lean in close. I would build really strong relationships with key people in that team. Listen intently, like what's really going on here, what are the reasons that have led to the behaviours that you're getting. See if you can find ways, even without budget, see if you can find ways for mini learn sessions to be done as a collective group. Maybe you might have to break that down into smaller groups, but I think if you start to pay more attention to them, quite literally pay more attention to them, that in itself will help to create a bit of a dialogue and a bit more of a relationship between the members of that team and potentially yourself. I think the other side of that is you need to set some boundaries. So what is acceptable in that team and what is not acceptable? And you can do that collectively. You can get them to write their own rules. One of the activities I use for things like this is a really simple team shield. You can look it up on the internet, there's loads of them. But that helps individual team members connect. It helps understand the collective strengths. It helps understand, you know, what do I really love doing? What do I hate about what goes on in the team? It really uncovers all kinds of things. And then you can lead that into what would I do? You know, what do we want to accept behaviorally across this team? And they'll self-regulate, you know, alongside you stepping in and doing what needs to happen from a leadership perspective. So regulating from a leader role, they will do the rest for you over time, not overnight.
You can also use something like guiding principles. So it's not necessarily about a process-driven thing or policy that you're putting in place, but it's more around how do we do things? What are we agreeing as a team?
Ways of working. I mean, I hate that term, but you know, like that kind of thing. What do we want to sign up to and commit to collectively?
Yeah.
I think boundaries is the most important one, and same with the performance conversation. You've got to set the boundaries there, and you can hold people accountable without, losing psychological safety. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Fab, thank you. Let's move on to the last question. So we'll launch the poll. We'll get it done in 2 minutes. We'll be fine. We'll be fine. If anybody needs to pop off because they've got a 12 o'clock, obviously feel free, and we've got it recorded. But right, our final poll. Can a performing but dysfunctional team have psychological safety? This is like the peak question. So when we were designing the answers, this is my favorite. What is this a trick question? So we'll just let people quickly think about that and answer. And then we'll have a quick shoot around the room, and then we will finish up. So I reckon, Mel, we might be able to see what the results are. Let's do it. I think she must be letting some more people vote. All right. Well, that's
There we go.
No. 58% no. 9% trick question. 32% yes.
Trick question.
All right, who wants to go first? Go, Sky. You go, Sky. What a polite bunch. We'll finish on Bernadette. There you go.
Okay, so I would say no is probably my response. I think if you're a dysfunctional team, there's an element of distrust in there. You're not working in that seamless flow that Sky mentioned, and I don't necessarily think that there's boundaries, because you're, I think of Cristiano Ronaldo, you're an individual, you might be a highly talented individual, but that doesn't mean that you're part of the team. And therefore you're not creating that functional element of the team. So that's my very short answer.
Well, we're out of time. Look at that, right on 12 o'clock. Well, look, thank you, or wherever you are in the world on your time zone. But thank you so much. I'm sorry, this is the first webinar where I've been looking around, so hopefully that's not like a tennis match for people. But thank you so much to Bernadette, Patrick and Sky for an amazing session. And thank you everybody for your incredible feedback. I've seen that popping up, and sorry I missed a few questions. But look, that's all we have time for. We'll share the recording link. I think there's also been quite a lot of references to maybe some different research, so I might get the links and pop that in an email when I send around the link, so keep an eye on that. London top and tail the recording for us, and so make it look all pretty. So that takes a couple of days, so it won't be immediate, but I'll get it to you eventually. I mentioned that we've got another webinar coming up on employment law, so keep an eye out on the Fraser Jones page and the LinkedIn page, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are. And we're off for lunch here in Sydney, so that's a wrap. See you all next time. Bye.